Thank you very much. I hope that you can get through this great transformation we're experiencing without the pain that many other countries are suffering. But I think it would be stupidity to think it's going to be easy to retain consensus. Now, I want to talk a bit about the historical context. We are in a wonderful building which is celebrating a wonderful history, many defeats, many advances, many traditions, and we all feel humble in coming to a place like this because we can feel the presence of our forebears who had to struggle for many of the social progresses that we have seen. But I want to give a historical context to argue that the Precariat is a class and that the Precariat is fundamentally different from previous classes. That is a controversial statement, I'm fully aware. I've addressed it in the second book, in the Precariat Charter in particular, addressing my Marxist friends, many of whom have been very angry with me for, in their view, dividing the working class. Quite a painful challenge. None of us can do that, it's done. If you go back and look at the time when Marx was writing, we were undergoing a great transformation that many of you will understand linked to Karl Polanyi's analysis. And that great transformation was about the painful construction of national capitalism, industrial capitalism. And in his words, there was a disembedded phase when laissez-faire and the pursuit of free markets dominated, where there was the dismantling of all the institutions of regulation and social protection of the past, where enclosure was advancing, and the proletariat was emerging. Now, proletarianization was about stabilizing wage labor. It was about proletarianizing people in their mind as well as in their behavior. It was about disciplining people to accept the clock. It was accepting the discipline of a factory, a mine, a stable wage labor relationship. And it's interesting to go back into the 19th century. It was the employers who pushed for legislation to give labor, workers, stability and security, because they wanted to stabilize the labor supply in full-time labor, disciplined. It's very ironic that it was the employers who pushed for that. And many workers' representatives resisted that. They didn't want to be stabilized in full-time labor. They resisted it. They wanted freedom. They wanted the capacity to have some sense of control over their lives. But the proletarianization took place in a context in which there was still a dangerous class. And that dangerous class consisted of the artisans, the craftsmen, the street traders, the people who didn't identify with the bourgeoisie, but they didn't identify with wanting to be part of the proletariat either. If you look at the creative energy in the cities of Europe, this class, the artisans, were resisting the stabilized labor relationship. They lost. And in the 20th century, one has a crisis of the Great Transformation because the insecurities and the inequalities developed and they were unsustainable by the 1930s. And in Polanyi's terms, we had the threat of the annihilation of civilization at that time. And the embedded phase was the post-war era of social democracy, where stable labor was pursued by the unions with a welfare state and a decommodification of labor, the activity. So a shift away from reliance on money wages to non-wage forms of remuneration, pensions, paid holidays, medical leave, all the things of the welfare state. It was a decommodification of labor, the activity, but not the people doing the labor. Because the essential relationship was, you do labor and you get returns. We will give you security if you do labor. If you think about it, that's not a very progressive position to take. Because it says, I will be subordinated to a boss. I will be disciplined. I will obey a boss. And in return, you give me some security. Thank you very much. If you think that is a position of the Enlightenment, I do not. So I hate the term golden age. I hate the term that this was some golden age that we've lost. It wasn't. When I was a student, we were revolting against that type of existence. If you look at 1968, and I was in the streets in Paris and in Grosvenor Square, we were revolting against what now is called the golden age. It's ridiculous. It was an advance on the past, without a doubt. What the trade unions had achieved, what social democratic parties had achieved, what socialists had achieved was an advance on the past, but golden it was not. Now we all know that subsequently in the 1970s, the era of the embedded welfare state capitalism started to crumble. And we had the beginnings of what I've called in my books the global transformation. The global transformation began with the neoliberals, the Mont Pelerin Society, and I've discussed them in more detail in this book on the corruption of capitalism, suddenly became the new orthodoxy. They pursued financial liberalization, the privatization of everything, the commodification of everything, and the dismantling of institutions and mechanisms of social solidarity. And of course, they pursued labor market flexibility. The Scandinavians called it flexicurity. But it couldn't get away from the fact that the flexibility was on the terms wanted by capital. And what it really meant was ushering in a period of growing insecurity. And the period of the disembedded phase, dominated by neoliberalism, pursued a strategy which has been dominated by the US, series of administrations of Republicans and Democrats who've constructed an international architecture that has transformed the global economy. The first thing that we all have to recognize is that when you opened up to the world, not Denmark, but all of our countries, the whole of the OECD, what happened overnight, metaphorically, and almost in reality, is that we saw a quadrupling of the world's labor supply. An extra 2 billion people became part of a globalized labor market. And all those 2 billion from China, from India, from Vietnam, from Indonesia, and so on, were resigned and habituated to accept a life that gave an income of 1/50th of what any Dane, any British or German would have accepted as the norm. Now, you don't have to have a PhD in economics to realize that if you do that, you're going to put huge downward pressure on real wages in the OECD countries, especially as productivity could rise dramatically fast in those emerging economies. That's precisely what has happened. So we have seen across the Western economies stagnating or falling real wages. First phenomenon. But in the process, one also saw a commodification of the firm. The corporation suddenly became fragmented. You could shift and transmort it, merge with others, change structures internationally. And in the same time as that was happening, you've seen a commodification of things like our education system. In my lifetime, the education system has been transformed to become an instrument of globalization and commercialization. We have seen the great subversive thinking that meant to take place in universities shrunk, while human capital development, breadwinning, going into the market, making money, has taken over. So our capacity as citizens has been diminished by the commodification process. It's a fundamental part of the whole neoliberal project. But we are no longer in a neoliberal phase. Because what has happened is that this international architecture has created a new phase in global capitalism, which is what I call rentier capitalism. More and more of the income is not just going to capital, but it is going in various forms of rent. The owners of physical property, the owners of financial property, the owners of intellectual property are taking more and more of the income. So those of us who rely on our work and labor are fighting for a smaller and smaller part, while the rentiers are taking more of it. That is the character of global capitalism today. And in the process, a new global class structure has taken shape. When I first put this forward, which was 20 years ago, people just thought, this is strange, it'll pass. Then when I tried to articulate more in the Precariat books, I thought, I think it's pretty clear now. Today, I'm much more sure that this structure applies. At the top, we have a plutocracy, global citizens, who gain most of their income from various forms of rent. These are the richest men in history, not just having more money, but having the capacity to buy more people than any rich person in the past. The richest man in history is probably a man called Carlos Slim. Carlos Slim, in 2004, his annual income could have bought 400,000 Mexican workers' annual income, right? Last year, his annual income could have bought 2 million Mexican workers. If you look back at the Rockefellers, the beginning of the 20th century, they couldn't have bought nearly as many workers with their annual income. That's called wealth. Below the plutocracy, which are corrupting our politics, is an elite who are serving them, making millions and millions, but serving the plutocracy. And then you have the Selskabet underneath them. The Selskabet are people that social democrats fought to create in the 20th century. They're people with pensions, with salaried employment, with paid holidays, paid medical leave, paid maternity leave, paid paternity leave. All the trappings that social democrats correctly fought for. But the numbers in the Selskabet are shrinking. And what you find is that more and more people in the Selskabet don't identify downwards. They don't identify with the people below them because they don't expect to be in that group below them, and they're getting more and more of their income in various forms of rent. And I've documented that in this book. This Selskabet no longer has a class consciousness of solidarity with other people relying on wages. So does not make sense to put them all in one basket and say this is a united working class. Below the Selskabet is the old proletariat, for whom the LO and other trade unions fought, labor law, collective bargaining, social democratic parties, etc. It is shrinking everywhere, and more of those in the proletariat are dropping downwards too. And down below the proletariat is the growing mass class of the precariat. And the precariat needs to be clearly defined. I urge everybody not to talk about precarious work or precarious labor. Talk about insecure labor, which is not the same as work, but reserve the term precarious for the precariat, and I will explain. You can define those people who are in the precariat by 3 dimensions, all class dimensions. The first dimension is that those in the precariat have distinctive relations of production in a Marxian terminology, quite different from the proletariat. They are being habituated to accept a life of insecure, unstable labor. Casual jobs, moving in out, short term, this sort of stuff. Interns, 0-hour contracts, all these new terms. Much of that is not new. For me, it is the least important aspect of the precariat. But most people concentrate just on that. More importantly are other aspects of the relations of production. If you're part of the precariat, you have no occupational identity, no occupational narrative that you're becoming something, you are something. You have a distinctive narrative to give to your life. Or an institutional narrative. I belong to a sector, I belong to a firm. If you're in the precariat, you don't have that. But more importantly, even than that, is that if you are in the precariat, you have to do a lot of work that is not labor. One of the problems they had with the translation into Danish is apparently you don't have separate words for work and labor, which is a great pity, but it's a reflection, I think, of too much social democracy in the 20th century. Work is what we want to do. Caring for our relatives, our communities, building our capacities. Work is what we do with our family and friends. It's work. It's ridiculous that in our labour statistics and our social democratic rhetoric, if I look after your elderly mother and you pay me a little, it's called labour. If I look after my own elderly mother, it's not. Think about the significance of that, because all work that women do, in particular, is not work. In our statistics, our rhetoric, our textbooks, we don't recognize it. But if you're in the precariat, you have to do a lot of other forms of work that if you don't do, you pay a heavy price. You have to spend a lot of time networking, relearning something because the last lot of tricks you learned don't get you anywhere. Filling in forms, standing in queues, applying to thousands of jobs, filling in CVs so that algorithms can weed you out. True. It's all work, it's not leisure, and yet implicitly, in the way we treat our statistics and our rhetoric, it doesn't count. It's free time. It's not. So that if you're in the precariat, you have to do a lot of work off workplaces, outside labour time, not recognised, but that's your reality. And that goes with the fact that if you are in the precariat, and this is unique compared with any time in history, almost certainly you will have a level of education that is greater than the level of labour you're required to do. And I must add a point here. The precariat is not just highly educated people in insecurity. It goes right down in our society to people living in slums, in tenements, in rental hostels, who are struggling to survive. They too tend to be more educated than the degrading existence that they have to accept. That is part of the relations of production, the norms that go with it. The second dimension is that the precariat has distinctive relations of distribution. If you are in the precariat, almost guaranteed, you have to rely almost entirely on money wages. Money that you can get from an employer or somebody, which is increasingly volatile and has been falling on average for 30 years or more. In addition, if you're in the precariat, your income is uncertain. You don't know whether you're going to be still receiving it next week, next month, next year. So this uncertainty is not easily insured by a welfare state. You're living on the edge of unsustainable debt. One mistake, one illness, one accident, one argument you have with some official, and you're out in the street. For millions of people, this is a nightly nightmare. The possibility that this could be their next experience. And in addition, the state, even in the wonders of Denmark, the state has been gradually shrinking entitlement to state benefits through means testing. Means testing means you only get it if you prove you are poor. But you may be lazy, and that's why you're poor. So we have to introduce tests to see if you are doing the right thing. All welfare states have gone in that direction. Means testing has increased faster in Sweden than in any other OECD country in this century. So anybody who tells me the Scandinavian model is alive and well and thriving is either naive or a liar. Because it's fundamentally changed, as many of my Scandinavian friends, particularly in Sweden, tell me. And I love Scandinavia, so I don't say it with any pleasure. The reality is that millions of people are facing poverty traps, where going from low benefits into a sort of low-wage job they can get means they're paying a marginal tax of over 80%. Huge disincentive to take casual jobs. But it's made worse by what I call in the books the precariat trap. Because you don't get your benefits straight away. You have to wait, you have to queue, you have to be obsequious, you have to be polite, you have to please some young bureaucrat who is also scared too. This is the situation that the precariat has to experience as routine. Imagine the degrading, stigmatizing feelings you have in those circumstances. And the third dimension is the precariat has a distinctive relations to the state. And for me, this is the defining feature of the precariat. We have an expression in English, denizens, not citizens. A denizen is a concept, don't worry, most British people or Americans would not know what the hell I'm talking about. A denizen was a term used in the Middle Ages to refer to somebody who came into a town and was given a more limited range of rights than the members of the town. So they weren't full citizens, right? They were given a more limited range. This is the first time in history when we're seeing citizens converted into denizens. Because it used to be that a denizen would come in, gradually earn, and become a citizen. Now we have millions of our own citizens losing rights without even knowing it. Losing cultural rights because they cannot belong to an organization that gives them a sense of their own culture, reinforcing their sense of being in a community. Losing civil rights because they cannot get access to due process before the law. A bureaucrat can take something away without any trial, without any proof. They just do it. I cannot tell you how many emails I get from people angered by that experience. No due process, no legal process. They're losing economic rights because they cannot practice what they're qualified to do. They're losing social rights because they cannot get access to benefits that many other citizens can receive. And above all, they're losing political rights. Because they do not see in the political spectrum parties or organizations that represent them and their aspirations as well as their insecurities. And that's a key point. Because if you are in the precariat, you're not just a victim. You are looking for a new golden age. You are looking for a new politics of paradise. You are dreaming. You are imagining a better society. That's great. It's fantastic. You don't suffer from a false consciousness that the answer to all your problems is being back in a full-time, stable job for 30 years. 30 years. And getting the equivalent of a golden watch at the end of those 30 years. That's not what many people in the precariat aspire to achieve. They aspire to achieve a life of dignity, a life in which they can become something and help in their community, help with care, caring for their loved ones, caring for their community, caring for the species. And that is why, fundamentally, the primary antagonist for the precariat is the state. They recognize the achievements of the social democrats of the last century, but no longer identify with the status quo. They want something better, and they must. And for me, this is important because for the Social Democrats, the answer to the growth of the precariat is to convert them all back into the proletariat. And that's not the answer they want. And that is why many of the precariat groups that I addressed, they're hostile to trade unions. And unless the trade unions understand why, the situation will get worse for all of us, because we need collective voice. We all need collective voice. But the unions and the political groups on the left have to relate more clearly to what's happening in the precariat. If they don't, we will see a continuing collapse on the left. We will see a continuing supremacy of a profoundly corrupt political right. We've seen that. And unless the precariat can mobilize and organize with this new politics of paradise, we're in for a very bad period ahead. But I want to end on the optimistic note, because everywhere I'm invited to go, I have the great privilege of addressing many precariat groups. And I feel there's a fantastic energy out there. There's a fantastic sense in which we've moved through a period when the predominant feeling of anybody in the precariat was to feel sorry for yourself, feeling you're a victim, feeling you're defeated, feeling you're not good enough, to a phase now where people are saying, hey, there are millions of people out there experiencing what I'm experiencing. That is the first step to what the sociologists call agency. The first step to being able to look in the mirror and say, hey, I'm part of the precariat. And let me tell you, I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that. I'm not ashamed. Lots of others. But we're going to do something about it. And we've reached that phase when more and more people are standing up and saying, hey, what can I do? What movement can I join? And I can promise you that I've been arguing for a basic income for 30 years. And the last 3 or 4 years, I've been enormously encouraged because precariat groups get it. They get it. They get it that it would be a matter of social justice, as I've argued in this book on basic income. It's a matter of giving people a better sense of freedom, better sense of control of their lives, and gives basic security a real meaning. And people who have basic security, their IQ goes up. Their ability to make strategic decisions, their ability to be citizens improves. It's not a matter of more or less efficiency compared with other forms of welfare. It is, but that's not the important thing. It's about building a new income distribution system in which giving people basic security is fundamental. And as I was saying to a journalist just beforehand, one of the most ironic features of my presentations on basic income over the years has been to find that the most vehement, hostile people towards basic income have been trade union leaders. The most vehement. It really gets them wound up. And you say, wait a minute, I may be wrong or right, but what I'm saying is people should have basic security. Isn't that what trade union leaders are meant to be fighting for? Okay, why are you so hostile? You could debate it, but why the hostility? And one trade union leader, very prominent one, when I put that to him at a conference, he puzzled over it and came back after a coffee break and he said, I think I know why we are hostile. If people had basic security, if workers had basic security, they wouldn't join trade unions. And I looked at him and I said, if you think about it, that's immoral. In other words, you want people to be insecure so they join you? That's disgraceful. That's not acceptable behavior. I said, but there's another part. You're also wrong. Because people who have basic security are more likely to have the confidence to join organizations. They're more likely to have the confidence to say no. They're more likely to have the confidence to bargain over better conditions, better treatment. A woman said to me last week, she said, what had convinced her about basic income is that she had been in an abusive relationship with a violent man for years, and she'd had to stay because she was financially broke. But then she got a basic income in one of our pilots, and she left that abusive relationship. Think about the implications. You have empowerment if you get basic security. Now, there are other policies we can talk about. I've tried to list them in the Precariat Charter. But for me, it's important to see the Precariat as a class in the making. A class that is defining a new progressive politics for the 21st century. The achievements of the past should stay in the past. We need a new progressive agenda. Thank you very much.